right, I think we might get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on industrial demand response, implementation types and contractual considerations. My name's Dylan McConnell. I'm a researcher here at the Energy Transition Hub. Before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners. So yeah, please join me in acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands that we're all joining this webinar from today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So this seminar is being jointly hosted by the Energy Transition Hub and the Climate and Energy College, and it's part of the Victorian Clean Technology Fund's seminar series on demand response. Today's webinar is going to be recorded, and the video will be made available on the website, and all of the slides will be made available as well. So in terms of how this will run, we'll hear from both of our panelists in a moment, who I'll introduce in a second, and at the end we'll invite you to submit questions to the presentation and to the panelists by clicking on the chat button and typing your questions there. And also, it really helps us if you click the raise hand button, so that we can identify you easily and sort of get you to ask your questions in person over the web. Okay, so today we're going to hear from Marija Petkovic and Alex Leemon. So we'll hear from Alex first, and he leads FlowPower's demand response work. He's managed demand response portfolios and frequency control ancillary services across Australia and New Zealand prior to joining Flow, and he's involved in building the first aggregated interruptible load program in the net. Marija is a founder and managing director of Energy Synapse. I'm sure you've probably seen some of her work in various media outlets, and Marija has implemented demand response and industrial demand response programs across Australia, New Zealand and the United States, and has held energy management roles in various consulting groups such as JSD. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over the controls to Alex, and then looking forward to hearing what they both have to say. All right, thanks, Alex.
Thank you, Dylan. So hi, as introduced, so Alex Leemon's my name, and yeah, so I'm the demand response lead here at FlowPower, and I'm really looking forward to having a little bit of a chat about how industrial customers can unlock significant savings through demand response, and specifically talking about how businesses can ensure that they're getting the best value out of demand response, focusing on one of the probably most overlooked aspects of demand response, which is it's often in really straightforward or simple processes, and getting those integrated into the business smoothly. So just a very quick overview for those who are not familiar with FlowPower. So we're an energy management company that has a retail license. And our goal is to get large energy users to really think differently about their energy and help drive the transition towards a net zero carbon future. So the key aspect that we're doing that is that all of our retail plans have some form of spot price exposure or incentive built in. So really trying to get customers to change the way they use electricity based on the pricing signals that are in the market, and also trying to offer power purchase agreements with renewable generation, so that customers are purchasing electricity from greener sources. So that's the core business of what we're focused on. So the first thing we want to talk about is really talk about some of the common barriers and misconceptions around demand response. A lot of these are things I hear every day, or particularly with new customers who are unfamiliar with demand response, or those sort of initial conversations. So whether these are when initially approaching a business and introducing the concept of demand response and how we might be able to work on that with the business, or some of these often then come down to on the day operational stuff, the kind of things that I hear over the phone or in email responses. There's problems with unable to being to stop operations. A lot of businesses are, I guess it's particularly ingrained, that there are a very set way of doing things, and there's no flexibility whatsoever in the operations. But what we actually find is when you look at the cost of scheduling those operations and scheduling those production runs, there's actually a fair bit of flexibility, particularly when you're talking about optimization of cost overall. So looking at, rather than just set schedules, but looking at the big picture of how those costs integrate into the business. To look at the bottom one, you know, we often get this sort of blanket, like, demand response is just too hard. It's not possible. Although I found that discussion tends to go away pretty quickly when the businesses find out that other companies in their same vertical, their same sort of segment of industry, are also able to do demand response. It's quite interesting to find out when a competitor has implemented a strategy that's helping them cut costs and be more competitive. It then changes thinking pretty quickly around how to actually do that. So it's actually working with operations staff to develop strategies that are actually going to be effective and reduce those overall costs. So one of the key things is it's really important that when we're talking about demand response, that everyone in an organization is really aligned as to why you're doing demand response. So demand response strategies are often set up at quite a high level of a business. We're often looking at a CFO level or a chief operations officer level. And then it's obviously not those people, those staff members that are actually implementing demand response. It's actually operational staff members that are going to facilitate those strategies and make actual changes. So to get the most out of those strategies, it's really important that those people then understand and care about why demand response is being done. So you have to communicate how the business is going to benefit, particularly in terms of value, so that the cost of the business and the savings that can be generated. And there's also often altruistic benefits for the grid and for other users in the electricity system, why demand response is being done. And also communicating that in general, we're talking about quite a limited number of events, quite a small change in operations that can produce very large savings, which is really significant. And when you communicate that message across your team, across the business, then it changes the mindset a lot. So one of the things we work with closely with our customers here is that we have a DR framework, a series of sort of tools to help customers implement demand response strategies. And it's really important that there are key people within the organization who are assigned as coordinators, as facilitators to set up, you know, to respond to demand response instructions or signals from your aggregator or from your retailer, and then the operational staff who can then actually implement those strategies. And it's important to have a facilitator who sits above all of that to actually look at how the overall business is positioned. So the cost of production relative to the cost of electricity, or the savings or the revenue that could be generated, and to make those decisions seamlessly within the business are really critical. And that's where we often see demand response strategies fall down, by not having key decision makers in organizations who can make those choices in real time. That's critical. And those roles really need to be set up ahead of time and communicated throughout the business. So as we've sort of discussed, it's really important to communicate through the business around the savings and the benefits. But sometimes it needs to go beyond just that communication of how an organization is going to benefit, and it needs to actually have some actual parameters set at an operational level as to how that's going to benefit to make it smooth. So one of the problems, for example, is that demand response, we're talking about shutting down or temporarily minimizing energy usage, which goes counter to a lot of operational targets. So operational staff are looking often at uptime and, you know, having smooth production runs and meeting production targets. So their key performance indicators and the metrics that their success as an employee are determined are separate to demand response. And switching off equipment is going to run counter to their motivation. So the organizations that our customers who do demand response most successfully have actually built demand response into those KPIs and set those targets at an operational level, so that it's not just a savings on the bottom line or a cost savings that might be registered by the CFO or by the energy manager, but operational staff can actually see the benefits and receive an incentive for the choices that they make for the work that they actually do implementing demand response. And that's really significant to getting an entire organization aligned and moving down that path to really successfully do demand response. And it's, as I said, the most successful businesses have really incorporated it into their business strategy to be flexible. The other thing that we often see is a major sort of problem or a barrier to demand response is having actually made some decisions and practiced or implemented training sessions into staff roles before it comes. So demand response, we're typically often talking about summer seasons, whether we're talking high prices or say the road program. And if you're making decisions as to how to do demand response in January, then it's too late. It's very rarely going to be an effective strategy. So, you know, one of the key problems we see is that new staff to a business are not trained appropriately or not explained what demand response actually is and why an organization might be doing that. So there needs to be that sort of knowledge sharing, that succession planning as new staff come into a business and old staff leave a business. And that has to explain why they're doing demand response and how it is going to work with their operational role. And then practice drills are actually really useful. So that's something that we do with our customers here. We do preparatory plans ahead of summer, ahead of those high-priced times that are going to occur, so that everyone in an organization knows what they need to do when you're given, you know, sort of only half an hour or an hour's notice to make those changes to your operations, because you really can't be running around like a headless chook half an hour out trying to figure that out. And to have a plan and a process in place. So, you know, particularly with larger organizations, documenting these processes, documenting these procedures, and actually distributing that through staff, and particularly when you're talking about a large number of sites, that is what really leads to successful outcomes, rather than sort of ad hoc decisions being made on a site-by-site basis, where there's no alignment with the central strategy. So just to sort of finish off this sort of discussion, I think it's worth actually putting some numbers to this and discussing how what we can actually be looking at when we have an organization that is aligned. So this is one of our customers. They're a large agribusiness. They have a number of sites, around a dozen sites spread across a number of plantations spread across Victoria. So getting their strategy across each of those sites and getting that strategy coordinated is absolutely critical to doing demand response successfully. They've got a head office in Melbourne, which is far removed from where the farms are actually located. The farms are in regional Victoria. So getting this aligned strategy across all of the staff when they're set out remotely was a critical strategy in getting this in place. So they set up a demand response strategy to save money. Those decisions were made at head office as a cost-saving measure to keep the business competitive on an international scale. And then they documented procedures and processes, and they set up demand response personnel at each site who are responsible for making those decisions. And everything runs through a central coordinator who knows what central production targets need to be met. They know what the cost of energy is, and they know what the cost of other supplies, what the cost of water is. And each of the staff on sites can go back to that central coordinator if they need to make a decision, whether they need to override a specific instruction or make a change to their strategy on the day. Victoria, we saw some quite high volatility, which prior to the year drove up a lot of contract prices. But in the end, if you could run on a wholesale price and run on a wholesale strategy where you're avoiding those peaks in the market and implement demand response, in Victoria in 2018, this customer saw a 23% reduction on their wholesale energy cost, which is an enormous reduction and very significant cost saving. So kind of highlights when you're talking about such a large number, and for a customer like this, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a monthly basis on electricity, 23% is a very large number. So getting those demand response strategies right and implementing them across the business have very real savings. And when you're talking about savings like that of such large numbers, you can often use some of that money to actually provide incentives back to the staff. So in this case, this company actually provides incentives to the staff out on site. There are monetary incentives to their salaries for getting their demand response strategy right, because it is so critical. So thank you for having me, for letting you talk about some of the basic barriers in demand response. And Marija is going to talk about some of the challenges in contracting demand response.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex. I've asked you to, I guess, keep your questions on hold until the end, and I think we'll do questions for both Marija and Alex together, and we'll pass over to Marija now. Thanks.
Okay, can you see that okay? Wonderful. Okay, so it's really great to be here this morning. Thank you very much for everyone who is on the call. Before I get started, if you're the kind of person who likes to tweet through these things, I've got the handles for myself and Energy Synapse in the bottom right. We're also on LinkedIn as well, so feel free to reach out to us there. Now, Alex did a great job in framing some of the discussion around why demand response is so important for industrials. And just to reiterate some of those points, the industrial sector is very unique. As a sector, it tends to be very energy intensive. And for an industrial, electricity is not just another utility. It's actually a key strategic input into your business. So every single dollar that an industrial can save on their electricity is a direct advantage that they have competitors. And demand response is one of the biggest ways that energy users can save on their electricity costs. So it's definitely something that is worth exploring and worth looking at how you can really optimize this process to work for you. Unfortunately, demand response tends to be quite complex, and it isn't easy to get right. And again, especially for the industrial sector, this isn't right for the commercial sector, where you might be talking about turning down an air conditioner in an office building. For industrials, demand response typically means interrupting your production process and producing your product. That's how your business earns revenue. So if we're talking about stopping that process, that has real implications for the revenue of business, for the operations of the business, maintenance costs, reliability, supply chain. And all of that needs to come together to actually make this worthwhile. Now, one of the key aspects of getting demand response right is to negotiate the right types of contracts. And unfortunately, what we find is that demand response contracts tend to be quite vague and they're very underspecified. And as an industrial that's trying to manage all these other risks that are unique to you when you're doing demand response, it's really important that you put in the right terms and conditions in those agreements. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from the past decade of experience that I've had in terms of implementing demand response. So at Energy Synapse, we are an independent research and advisory firm. We advise large energy users and particularly industrials on how they can implement demand response. We're also very active in things like renewables and storage. But what I'll be going through today doesn't just come from my experience as an advisor, but also the many years that I've spent working in-house and doing demand response as a large industrial myself, and implementing those programs all around the national electricity market in WA and New Zealand and all over the US as well. So what I'll be going through today, just to put a little disclaimer, this is not an exhaustive list of all the ways that demand response can be done and the various types of contracts you can have. I don't have enough time to go into all of that today, but it is just, I guess, an explanation of some of the more common issues and permutations. So the first thing I wanted to go through is just the different types of demand response that are actually out there, and how you can access these different forms of demand response. When we think about demand response, the most common picture that a lot of people have in their head is a scenario where we're in summer. It's a day with record-breaking heat. A coal-fired power station has tripped somewhere, wind generation is low and the grid is on its knees. We're in an emergency situation and there is potentially going to be a blackout. And in that situation, AEMO might call on large energy users to reduce their load to help avoid a blackout. And that's what I've termed here as an emergency reserve service or the RERT. But of course, that demand response is much, much broader than that. I view demand response as a load changing in response to a signal. And that signal can be a variety of things. So it can be a lack of reserve situation, like you having the RERT, but it can also be the other types of demand response that I have on this slide. So I want to first contrast the RERT with economic demand response, because they are both to do with what's happening in the energy market. But with economic demand response, where you are responding directly to the spot price, this doesn't have to be an emergency situation. This is just a response for no other reason than an economic gain. And if you feel that it is worthwhile for you to be reducing your energy usage when the price is at a certain level, you are able to do so. So it's not necessarily for those very rare events. You could be, and especially if you're spot exposed, you could actually be managing your load in response to the spot price on a daily basis if you wanted to. So in terms of economic demand response, there's two main ways you could do that. You could have an agreement with a retailer that allows you to respond to spot prices, or you could be on a retail deal where you are directly taking the spot price. So your actual price for electricity is varying every 30 minutes. Now in that particular scenario, it has a very big advantage because it lets you keep 100% of the savings that you have gained from demand response. Whereas any time that you are contracted with a third party, like say your retailer, they will be taking a cut of those savings. But of course, the flip side is that spot exposure is definitely not for everyone. And if you are going to go down that path, you need to make sure that you have the expertise and the knowledge to actually be able to manage that process. So when you have an agreement, it allows you, if it's important for you to have a firm price for electricity, it allows you to still have that firm price and then have some optionality around responding to spot prices if you want to. Now, and that's actually this economic demand response, that's by far the most common type of demand response that we see in the national electricity market. Another type of demand response has to do with helping the grid remain stable and managing the frequency of the grid. So our grid is designed to operate at a frequency of 50 hertz, and say if a power station trips, that might result in the grid frequency dropping to dangerously low levels. And then as someone who's providing response, demand response, you might be called upon to reduce your load so that you can then help to raise that frequency back up to where it should be. So again, so this is a very different type of demand response. It's not about responding to wholesale energy prices. Now the signal that you're responding to are frequency deviations in the grid. And again, this is something that can be done in a number of different ways. You could have an agreement with your retailer who allows you to access FCAS markets. You could also do this through a third-party aggregator who isn't necessarily your retailer, or you could do it directly yourself by registering directly with AEMO as a market ancillary service provider. And again, when you are doing something yourself, it allows you the ability to keep 100% of those savings for yourself, but you would then be responsible for managing all the bidding, managing the registration. So if that's not something that's within your area of expertise, that's when it would make sense to, I guess, do that type of demand response through a contract. And then the last type of demand response that I have listed there is for network services. So this would be a deal done directly with your distribution company or your transmission provider, depending on how you connect to the grid. And in this scenario, you are helping the network provider to avoid the need to upgrade and spend capital upgrading their infrastructure. So you might, for example, be managing peak demand on their lines or congestion on certain systems. Now, with this type of demand response, it's generally done, as I said, through a direct deal with the network provider. You can also go through an aggregator, but listen, if you are someone who is playing in megawatts, I always very strongly recommend that you contract directly with the network provider, because having a middleman in this situation doesn't really provide any benefit. They would just be there to take a cut of your savings, but they're not really providing any risk management or expertise. So it's definitely, I think, if you are in the megawatt scale, it's worth contracting that on your own. Now, if I just quickly circle back to the economic demand response, because it is the most common one of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, and if you're an industrial energy user on the line, I really want you to write this point down. One of the biggest tips I can give you is to negotiate that demand response agreement at the same time that you are negotiating your electricity contract for your electricity supply. Because what often happens is people will come to us and tell us, we're thinking about doing demand response, can you help us kind of figure out how to do it? And then I'll say, well, okay, tell me about your retail contract, where that's up to, and they'll say, oh, well, just a few months ago, we signed a 2-3-year deal with retailer X, and now they're thinking about demand response. So if you're in that situation, you have given up almost all of your leverage in the negotiation, and it ends up being quite difficult then to negotiate a deal with really big terms. So you always want to negotiate your economic demand response agreement at the same time as your retail contract, because if retailers know that the retail contract is on the line, they're going to be much more willing to come to the party with terms and conditions that are outside of their standard practice. So again, there's all sorts of different ways that payments for demand response can work, but these are, I guess, two of the most common types of structures. So in the first example, we have a situation where we have a fixed capacity style payment. And what this essentially means is that, and actually just to take a step back here, if I go back to the previous slide, you'll see that the grid stability and the emergency reserve, they are AEMO services. So in terms of contracts, even if you're dealing with a third party, they will likely reflect very closely the AEMO requirements. So there isn't too much scope to get creative with contracting. So most of what I'm going to describe now has to do with how you can structure your economic demand response in your network service deals, because you have a lot of flexibility to make those, to make a structure for those that's really works for your particular business. So if I go back to this payment structure slide, when we're talking about a fixed capacity style payment, that's really a payment for being available. So you might agree, for example, with your retailer or your network provider that they're going to pay you an X amount of dollars over the next year, and that you're going to be available for them to curtail your load as needed. And on the flip side of that, the other type of structure is a variable structure. So in the variable structure, rather than having this fixed payment, you would be paid based on your performance for a specific event when it's called. So what's the difference between the two? The big one is that on a fixed payment, it's the retailer or the network provider who's taking the risk on actually getting that right. So say, for example, if we're dealing with the spot market, and if the retailer asks you to curtail your load, you curtail, but then the spot price doesn't, they were expecting it to be $10,000, but it actually ends up being $300. You still get the payments that were pre-agreed as part of your fixed structure. So the retailer's taken the risk from that. Whereas if it's a variable payment that's based on the prevailing spot price, then you might, your payment would be based on the actual prevailing prices over that period. Now, one of the big implications with having a fixed capacity style payment is that typically, firstly, your counterparty, so your retailer, they will be the ones who make the call on when you curtail. And secondly, when you are asked to perform, performance is generally mandatory. And what I mean by that is if you don't perform when they ask you to reduce your load, there will be some sort of penalty associated with that. Whereas on the variable structure, you can have flexibility to self-nominate events if you negotiate that kind of term, or you can still make that decision fall back on the retailer if you want to. And generally speaking, your performance in these events, you can negotiate them to be a little bit more optional because you're not getting this fixed payment regardless of your performance. So one of the big implications there in terms of who actually calls the event, and this is something that's quite important again, if you give that decision to your retailer, obviously that is much easier for you. You don't have to have the expertise in the market to be able to predict when these events are coming. So if you don't have that expertise, that's a great option. But be aware that when the retailer is in control of your curtailment decisions, they are using your demand response to optimize their portfolio and to optimize their profitability. And their interests, and especially if they also have a fleet of generators, isn't always going to be aligned with your interests. So you may be missing out on some savings with that kind of model, but if you don't have the expertise to be able to nominate events yourself, that can be quite useful. Now, this slide is one of the most important slides that I'm going to go through today. And it's a really important concept when you're doing either demand response in the spot market, even if it's through a retailer negotiating agreements, or if you are fully spot exposed and you're managing that yourself. This concept is incredibly important, and it's all about optimizing your payment or your trigger prices based on the unique risk profile for your business. So here I have an example from one of our clients who have been kind enough to let us use them as an example. So I'll go through how their particular process works and kind of what they're able to do within this one production site. So this is one of their facilities in Victoria. It's a 14 megawatt production facility, and as I said, at maximum output it operates at 14 megawatts. It can also ramp down to about 12 megawatts, so that's a 2 megawatt drop, and they can manage that ramping relatively easily. They're still producing products at those levels, so it's not too much of a business risk. So I mean, this is something, that 2 megawatt ramp, that's something they could be doing on a daily basis. It's low risk, and they could get away with a reasonably low price for that 2 megawatt demand response and still have it be quite economic. Now, the next step they can take is that they can shut down one of their production lines. Now, this is a more medium risk because it means that they are stopping production for one of their products. This happens to be a lower value product, but they're still stopping that production process. And this is something that they can't necessarily do on a daily basis, so they would need a higher price to manage this risk. And then the next step is to do a full site shutdown. And this is the highest risk level. So for them to take something like this on, they would need to have quite a lucrative price. So, you know, within a plant, you will often have these various different levels, and it's very important, as I said, to be pricing, to understand the risk levels from each load reduction and to price those accordingly. And even within a same company, different plants will have different risk profiles. So when I was working in the US, for example, we had a portfolio of about 50 major, 50 plus major production facilities. So this is within one large industrial, and those plants would range from brand new facilities that are fully automated, they're designed for flexibility, they've got all the bells and whistles, you can do, you know, whatever you want with them. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you might have a plant that's 40, 50 years old. It's completely manual, And with that plant, you basically are praying and crossing your fingers, because if that plant goes down, it might take you 2 weeks to get it back up running again. So when you've got that kind of situation, you might actually decide, well, for that kind of facility, we're not going to do demand response at all because it's just too high risk. Or if it's a little bit less extreme, you might still decide that you're willing to take some actions, but the price for each kind of megawatt reduction at that site is going to be very, very different to another site in your portfolio. So don't let a retailer try to tell you that every megawatt that you drop is worth the same amount of money. It's not. So I think when you're negotiating these agreements, it's very important to really understand this and have separate price points that reflect your risk. Because if you do this well, you will not only be able to reduce your costs a lot further in demand response, but you will also be managing your operational and business risks much more effectively. And now in this slide, I'm going to go through some of the other ways that you can manage business risks when you are negotiating these agreements. And if you have that fixed capacity style payment structure, the absolute most important thing you can do is specify the number of maximum events that the retailer can call you for. Okay, I want you to write this down. You need to, your contract needs to state the maximum number of events they can call. But it is very dangerous if you're in a situation, say there's a freak event during summer and they need to be calling you day in, day out, and you haven't specified a maximum in your contract, and they very often don't have, as a default, this isn't specified, you could find yourself losing a lot of money. So that is absolutely essential that you have a maximum. And then what you also want to do is say, and if the retailer wants to, or the network provider, if they want to call for more events than the specified maximum, then give yourself the ability to refuse that with no penalty. Or if you do accept, then there should be a further payment on top of that. Okay, that's one of the most important ways that you can really protect yourself and manage the risk when you're doing demand response. Another related issue is to define the maximum length of the event that they can call. So rather than them calling you for an indeterminate amount of time, so them saying, you're going to be offline for 24 to 48 hours or whatever it is, make sure that that's very well defined. And again, and this will depend on, what time you want to set will really depend on the specifics in your process. But do you have those conditions in place that if the event is going to be longer than the maximum, you can refuse, or there'll be extra payments that the retailer or the network provider needs to provide for you to go beyond that agreed maximum. Now, this next one is around events and consecutive days. And this is really something that, again, depends on your process. Some production facilities, they might have no issue going on consecutive days. But for a lot of industrial energy users, and typically if it might take, after your shutdown, it might take you, 10, 12 hours to actually get the production process back up to where you're producing product. If you're in that situation, then having consecutive events and consecutive days can be very, very risky. So what you may want to do is say that you will not accept, or that you can refuse a request to curtail on a consecutive day, or again, having that extra payment. And very quickly, just to wrap up on the last few, you always want to set a minimum notice period in your contract as well. So typically this will depend on really your operation and how fast you can really implement your approval process, the logistics, safety checks. Some plants you might only need half hour's notice to be able to get all those ducks in a row to be in a position to shut down the process. Or, I've had situations where a production site is totally unmanned and it's in a remote location, and you need to give, 4 hours notice so that you can get a plant operator to actually go on site and complete the shutdown. But this is where kind of knowing those specifics of your process is really important to negotiating the demand response agreement. And then my last point there is just about understanding your response times. So for example, with something, if you're doing something like frequency control, that might require you to respond as quickly as 6 seconds. So that typically means that you have to trip your process. So it's an emergency stop, and that has reliability implications. It has maintenance implications. You're potentially putting a lot of stress on the equipment, and that kind of very quick response, you're probably going to demand a higher price than, say, if the response time is 30 minutes, which allows you to do a controlled stop of the process. So listen, that was a very quick overview from myself of some of the key contractual issues. As I said, it's definitely not an exhaustive list, but I hope that gave you some starting points, I guess, on where to start when you are thinking about entering into demand response. And I look forward to your questions.
Great, thanks, Marija. Thanks for that. I'm sure there's plenty of questions. So just a quick reminder, please raise your hand so it's easy for us to find you and unmute you. Yeah, I see Kate Hamilton has raised her hand, so I might unmute you, and I'll get you to ask the first question, please. Looks like Kate may not be there. I'll move on to Robin. I saw he had some questions in the chat as well. Off you go, Robin. You should be able to talk now.
Hi, thank you for a very good presentation. I'm wondering, what is the minimum sort of size you need to be before you consider getting into these arrangements?
So in terms of megawatts?
Yeah, in terms of megawatts, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's really about the interplay of, how much does it cost you to shut down a process versus what is the cost saving? It's really that ratio that determines your value rather than your raw size. But I think definitely your size will affect the type of demand response agreements that you might look into. But I mean, I typically recommend people to be playing in a megawatt scale.
I just add a comment to that I definitely agree that it's about that value of ratio, that cost ratio. From our retail perspective, we have customers as small as 50 to 100 kilowatts doing demand response, doing economic demand response. And as Marija said, there are challenges. If you're smaller, it will limit being able direct participation if you're too small. So you do need to be in the megawatt sort of size and above if you are considering sort of direct participation models with AMO or others.
And the time scale can be 30 minutes or 60 minutes for providing
well,
that?
The time scale depends on what you negotiate. So I mean, don't let a retailer dictate to you what the time scale is. Your first step is to really figure out what makes sense for you and your process, what kind of time scale actually works for you, and then try to push that onto the retailer. That would be my advice. Alex,
Thanks, guys.
I was going to say it depends very much on the type of the program. So RERT contracts with AMO are 1 to 4 hours, FCAS up to 10 minutes if you're doing ancillary services, and spot price exposure. Last year we had an event that went 6 hours at maximum price. So if you're taking a direct spot price exposure, then you're looking at 6 hours of potential above $10,000 wholesale pricing. So, but yes, there's how your business flexibility will factor into how long you can shut down and what you can do. So that has to be considered in how you structure your arrangement with the counterparty for sure.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alex. Next up, I'll Mitchell O'Neill. Just unmuted you. You should be able to fire away.
Hey, cool. Yeah, so with the MAST that was implemented a few years ago, we've seen a few providers be registered in a little bit of capacity, but maybe not as much uptake as we expected. If the wholesale demand response provider is implemented, how much uptake or appetite do you think there is for the market there in separating maybe who they're going with for demand response versus who they're going with for just the front?
Well, I think that'll be a really interesting change, because I'm hoping that that will incentivize more third-party aggregators to actually act as aggregators, because at the moment, if you've only got that FCAS value stream, the opportunity is a little bit limited. But if you can also offer economic demand response through the spot market, then that should provide more incentive for aggregators to actually come into that market. But the specific question around FCAS, and I mean, just our experience in terms of industrials, and I touched on this a little bit in my talk, one of the issues with FCAS is when you have those very quick response times, as I said, with an industrial process, you are often doing an emergency stop in that situation. Operations and maintenance teams, they get very, very nervous when you do things like that. So I mean, that can be difficult to get across the line, and that's probably why we see a smaller uptake in that kind of product, because I think there's fewer people that can, or fewer organisations that can do that effectively.
I think just to add one comment, I think it will be interesting to see the final determination on the wholesale demand response mechanism, because one of the challenges at the moment, the way I see the rules, is they're quite prescriptive, particularly around the scheduling of loads. And I think the aggregating party takes on a lot of risk in managing participation in the wholesale demand response mechanism. So whether that encourages more sophisticated participants to enter the market, international companies who do this overseas, and are willing to take on that risk, and how they structure contracts with industrials. But it's possible that if the rules become too onerous, we may see industrials who would like to do this negotiate better contracts with retailers who haven't traditionally offered a lot of demand response offerings. So we may see more uptake of demand response, but in a sort of non-scheduled manner, which AMO will decide whether or not that's for the best. But I do think in general the rule change will encourage a lot of people who have been sitting on the fence or considering demand response to enter into this market.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks. Next up, we've got Matthew Stubbs. Matthew, if you'd like to ask your question. And I forgot to mention, please introduce yourself or any affiliation for you asking questions too, please.
Thanks. I was being very shy and doing a written question. Yeah, Matt Stubbs from Profigy. We provide asset management solutions for solar generators. My question was about I guess, given the impact on production for industrial, is there a business case for a level of local storage in addition to demand response?
Yes. Yes, probably. I think I'll say there's sort of two things. One, I've often always thought of a lot of businesses that can do demand response because they have storage inherently in their operations. So not just energy storage, but for example, there's a lot of cold stores in companies that have large chilling systems that have an innate thermal storage that could actually flex that thermal storage to do demand response more efficiently. And there are a number of other industries where you have various storages. So the agricultural industries often have water storage to manage their watering. So being able to flex storage against demand response is the sort of the best way of being able to do demand response. If we're talking about energy sort of storage, the cost of battery systems is still very expensive, and you need to stack the revenue streams from multiple sources. So arbitrage in the energy market, FCAS markets, and also sort of network support. And we're typically still seeing government subsidies in the form of trials, usually people like ARENA providing funding to make those battery systems economical for an industrial customer. But that said, there are emerging changes in the market. So for example, in places like South Australia and Queensland, where you've got high solar production in the middle of the day and you're getting very low prices, that arbitrage gap is increasing. And so it is changing the economics of the storage model. So the ability to charge the battery using solar in the middle of the day, and you use almost free electricity in the middle of the day, and then flex that storage when the prices are high later. Yes, we're seeing those economics change a lot.
I mean, from our perspective, In terms of battery storage, we haven't really seen that stack up for any industrial yet that we've worked with. It's typically much more economic to actually use their own demand response rather than investing in a battery. But the other type of really interesting storage, and again, not as Alex alluded, not necessarily energy storage, is actually your product storage. And this is something that we work a lot with industrial users because that's your natural buffer to actually helping you manage your supply contracts with your customers and whatnot. So I mean, what a lot of industrials are actually doing, either to their retrofitting their existing plants, or when they're building new plants, is they purposefully overbuild their product storage capacity so that they can really ramp up production when prices are low, and then take a shutdown and still have plenty of storage, whether it's a tank or a warehouse or whatever, still have plenty of storage so they can keep supplying their customers while the plant isn't actually producing new product.
Great, thanks.
Great, thanks. And yeah, up next we've got Ben Beatty. Ben, you would want to ask your question?
Yeah, g'day, thanks. I spent a couple of years or a few years working for a large energy consumer in Queensland, one of the gas producers. So it's a decent contrast when you're looking at the dramatic spikes in power that were occurring. So at the beginnings of 2016 and 2017, the site I was on was consuming about 150 megawatts of load, and that was spread across a couple of different sites. But situations, a couple of hours of high power prices could be a month's worth of electricity in normal times. So in that sense, the business had a lot of control systems back to a central control room, and I'm a control systems engineer, so I was investigating not fully automated mechanisms to dial down at certain periods, but certainly some way to initiate it and have it in a controlled manner. But I see some places, say maybe a big refrigeration company, might not have those kind of technologies in place. What's your thoughts on physically how to implement it? Because I think a lot of people understand even dialing back in their own, managing their usage during peak periods is probably the first step.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So with our spot price responsive customers that we manage here, the actual vast majority, around 70 to 80% of them, are actually still manual. So it becomes really important to be able to forecast the times of the spot price, which is, if anyone's ever seen AMO forecasts and observe spot price closely, that is incredibly challenging. So having enough lead time so that staff can actually physically get out to manually switch off equipment becomes really critical in that. And then control system automation is, that's really the ideal. So as you say, like people who can switch that off from a centralized control room. In our case, we actually have an in-house product that we provide to customers where we can actually manage assets on their site using our device. And there are obviously other players in that market that have that capability. But yeah, that is actually one of the major challenges is getting the in-demand response, is being able to get out and switch off equipment, particularly older equipment that isn't able to be integrated into centralized control systems. We've seen that at a number of customer sites, and in some cases it's making the CapEx business case to spend that money and upgrade equipment could have benefits in the long run, particularly if you're dealing with volatility and unpredictable forecasts.
Yeah, I just said that often upgrading to those kind of controls, particularly if it's an old plant, that can be very costly, and it's not necessarily going to be always worthwhile. It's certainly worth looking into, but if it's an old plant who's kind of at the end of its life, it's probably not worth doing. And from an energy user perspective, the best thing to do is probably just to negotiate an agreement that allows you that lead time. As Alex said, if you need people to actually go in and manually open valves, 100 valves in the process, kind of making sure that you have the adequate lead time to do that.
Great, thanks. I've got a bit of a follow-up question to that. How do you see the move to 5-minute settlement making that more challenging or less challenging, or I guess the impact of 5-minute settlement on demand response more broadly?
So I have maybe an opinion that counter to others in the industry, maybe. I think 5-minute settlement will change bidding behavior significantly. And I actually think we'll see more volatility, but I think we'll see less extended volatility in many ways, if that sort of makes sense. So one of the problems we see at the moment is generators, particularly some of the slightly slower generators, leave bid stacks. I call it like the day ahead or the morning before bid stacks, and they'll leave them until the afternoon. And then they make rapid changes in response to real-time changes in the price to take advantage of that 530 flex. So what this means is if the price spikes it to above $10,000 towards the market price cap, then they can easily rebid in capacity and it lowers the price and they're going to get the 30-minute average. So my feeling is that if you're in a 5-minute paradigm, you're no longer able to do that. So I actually think we're going to see a change in the way bid stacks are structured. And if anyone's ever looked at bid stacks, there's a big dead zone, the knee point between the sort of $500 range and the $10,000 range. I think we're going to see some generators actually putting capacity into that unused range to try to undercut other competitors and get some value, because they're no longer going to be able to rapidly rebid to capture the 530 value. So that's my general feeling. So I think it will change the nature of demand response. We'll see more of these volatile events spike up every now and again, particularly constraints will still bind in the market, but I think we'll see less extended and we'll see a change in the behavior, particularly on hot days.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I think for some types of demand response, like virtual power plants that are utilizing batteries, 5-minute settlement is going to be a dream. But for industrial energy users, I think a lot of them, and as a group, I think they'll find that environment more challenging. And the response times will be shortened naturally, because you're not going to be able to have as much lead time as you can in a 30-minute world. And that might push some people to move away from, say, providing spot market demand responses. They might kind of become more interested in doing things like the BRT or our network side deals.
Great, thanks. We're just about at time. I'm going to ask one more question via Glenn Drover. An interesting question, and I think Alex mentioned, you know, the low prices in the middle of the day and due to excess solar, etc. Are you guys aware of any sort of initiatives looking at, I guess, the reverse of, like, mostly what you've been talking about, sort of demand response, where you're increasing load? Or other sort of response options to soak up that excess solar?
Listen, if you're on a spot pass-through deal, you can absolutely already take advantage of that. So I mean, we already work with energy users who are not only reducing their load during high prices, but they'll be, you know, ramping up to absolute max production when those prices hit zero or negatives. I mean, that's already for people who are on that kind of agreement, so they're already able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's yeah, certainly one of the benefits of that, taking the wholesale price, particularly in regions like South Australia and Queensland at the moment that are seeing those big duck curve behaviour. I'd probably add that we are seeing, so for industrials that have solar capacity, something that has snuck up is, of course, the inverse of that. If you're used to using all of your solar load in the middle of the day, and you're now and even exporting, and now you're copying a negative price on a non-scheduled asset, where you yourself are the counterparty because it's your own asset, we are definitely seeing energy users actually look at how they can basically switch off from under the solar. So turn off that use, not copy negative price, and soak up the zero or very low or negative spot prices. And interest in that is growing rapidly.
Dylan, you're muted.
I think you might be on mute.
Apologies for that. Okay, I just wanted to thank both Alex and Marija for their presentations today, and all our attendees for yeah, coming along and asking excellent questions. So yeah, thanks again. And for those that are, you know, following along with our seminar series, our next one's coming up, you know, this Thursday next week, and it'll be from one of our PhD students, Kennedy, talking on the politics of trade and environmental linkages. So that'll be next Thursday at 11 a.m. All right, thanks again, and I hope you enjoyed today's seminar.
Thank you.
That's all. Thank you for having us.
No worries.